I've always wanted to try a tilt shift lens, mostly just to experiment, to see if I actually enjoy using one and the type of photos I can create. But the price was always a clear barrier. Not knowing if this was a lens that I'd want to continue to use regularly, obviously I just couldn't justify trying one out. That's until now. So this is a 50mm f1.4 tilt shift lens at a really friendly, affordable price. I have it here in the Fuji X mount, but it is available in other mounts. A super affordable option that hopefully opens the world of tilt shift lenses up to a lot more people. But how does it actually perform? Of course, as a much more budget option, there is some things to note when it comes to image quality. But is it good enough to really experiment with your first tilt shift lens? I think it might be, but let's jump in and find out. So this is a totally manual lens. It is APS-C for some mounts, or either APS-C and full frame on Sony. So I'm using the X mount on my Fuji X Pro 3, making it around a 75mm equivalent on full frame. If you know anything about tilt shift lenses, you know they can be ridiculously expensive, which is pretty crazy that this one comes in at $226 US. So even for a budget option, this is pretty crazy, especially if you can get some decent results. But that's what we need to find out. Quick note and thank you to 7Artisans who did send me this lens to try out. I was eager to experiment with it. I will give you my thoughts, but ultimately in my reviews, I like the photos to do the talking, so I'll provide plenty of different examples so you can really see if this lens is able to get the results that you want it to and if it's worth checking out. For anyone who's unfamiliar with the world of tilt shift lenses, we have two unique options on these, both shift and tilt functionality. The shift function basically decreases distortion when shooting with a wide angle lens. So this can be really useful in things like architectural photography, but unfortunately at 50mm or a 75mm equivalent to full frame, this isn't particularly useful as you'd often be using this at a wider angle. So for this particular lens, I'm much more interested in the tilt function. This is what allows us to do a very selective type of focus, essentially controlling the part of the photo that looks sharp by tilting the focal plane in relation to the image sensor plane. So it allows you to do some pretty unique things like putting two different subjects in focus or having this really dramatic, really shallow depth of field, often seen in this kind of tiny world or miniature effect that most people know tilt shift lenses for. So this unique change in depth is why I've always wanted to try one out. Another benefit of this particular lens is its widest aperture of f1.4. Great for creating that really shallow depth of field or for using in low light conditions. The build quality actually feels surprisingly good for such a cheap lens, having this solid metal feel to it. For its size, it's actually reasonably heavy. According to the website, it's coming in at 364 grams. It would appear no weather sealing, which I'd expect. Not having used a more professional tilt shift lens before, I cannot really compare, but I'd imagine the dials and shifting would feel slightly more premium on those. Although these do all work fine, they can be slightly fiddly to adjust at times. For tilting the lens, we have this tightening knob here and underneath a wheel here to easily adjust this. The shift function has 5 different adjustments. Again, probably not particularly useful at this focal length. We also have an aperture ring and focusing ring, which turned nice and smoothly. Didn't bother me, but just to note, you will find quite a bit of focus breathing with this zooming in or out when changing focus. It has a 46mm filter size and comes with this strange screw-on lens cap, which is a bit annoying, honestly, to screw on and off, so I tend just to leave it off. So overall for this price, really nothing you can complain about. It feels well built, perhaps lacking some of the finer control that you'd find on a much more expensive tilt shift lens, but again, expected. But let's jump into what I'm most interested in, the photos. I do mostly use real world examples in my videos because that's what's useful to me. How does it perform at the type of shots you actually want to capture on this lens? Firstly, without any shift or tilt, as you'd expect, wide open at f1.4. For a lens at this price point, we find a few issues. A real lack of contrast and even some purple fringing here in the center, and naturally slightly poorer image quality as we go into the corners. But nicely here, very little chromatic aberration. Improves a little bit by f2, but again improving significantly by f2.8. And then performs actually pretty well from about f4 or 5.6 onwards, which is typically what I expect from a more budget lens such as this. Of course, you still can use it wide open, but for me, the widest I've mostly been using this lens is around that 2.8 mark. One thing to note here, as a totally manual lens, the metadata didn't actually tell me which aperture I was using, so those earlier examples, I had to actually note this down. For the rest of the more casual shots I took, I can only really guess which aperture I was using, but I was mostly using between f4 and f11 with some shots at f2.8. So no real surprises here to me. You aren't getting the highest image quality at those wider apertures, but just beyond that, from 2.8, you get super usable results, which is pretty decent for a lens like this, especially when you consider that it does open up these tilt shift options. To me, I think this is where this lens really does shine though, for anyone who wants to experiment with these different effects and not pay a fortune to do so. It really is such a great entry point, and for that reason, I actually quite like this lens, as long as you are buying it for that specific purpose. If you're buying it to use as more of a conventional 50mm lens and very rarely, just occasionally use these tilt options, this probably isn't the right lens for you. But if you really want to experiment and try out those tilt functions and hopefully use them pretty regularly, it's definitely a fun one to try out. So even if you are looking to spend a lot more money on another tilt shift lens, I think this can actually be a great starting point. See if it's worth going out and spending a lot more money on, if it's something that you're going to keep using regularly. Here are a few more different perspectives I captured using the tilt options. Again here, the type of photography I quite like shooting, which is this casual street photography. I was able to get quite a few interesting results, just adding this new perspective or different layer to these type of photos. For more cityscapes and landscapes, this effect can also be really fun to play around with and create some really interesting results. But is this lens going to be right for you? Honestly, that depends. If you're looking for a tilt shift lens just to experiment with and maybe play around with for the first time, this is seriously a great option. But if you're looking for this to replace your much more expensive tilt shift lenses, this definitely isn't it. I don't think that's its intended market, and it's not quite at the level of those lenses, but nor could you ever expect it to be at this price point. So honestly, well done to 7Artisans for giving this a real crack. I think it really opens the world of tilt shift lenses up to so many more people, and for its price point, it does a pretty good job at that. So thanks so much for watching. Keep on creating and keep on growing, my friends. I will catch you in the next one. Bye for now.